Do you ever find yourself second guessing which metering mode to use in wildlife photography? There are so many options: spot, evaluative, center weighted. Wildlife photography doesn't always give us the luxury of stopping and thinking through the camera settings. And selecting the right metering mode when the clock is ticking, it's easier said than done. But what if I told you that you can shoot wildlife with just one metering mode without switching and still get the exposure you want in almost every situation? In this video, I'll show you the simple way I approach metering in the field and why sticking to a single predictable mode has worked far better for me than constantly changing settings. But before we talk about metering modes, let's first understand what metering actually is. Metering is simply your camera telling you what it thinks the right exposure for a scene is. See, every camera has a built-in light meter. Its job is only to read the reflected light in a scene and estimate whether the image will be too bright, too dark, or somewhere in between. Now the camera shows this information to you on the exposure meter. When the meter is at 0, the camera is telling you that it thinks the exposure is correct. If the meter moves to the positive side, the camera thinks the scene is getting brighter. Now, if it moves to the negative side, the camera thinks the scene is getting darker. See, I don't want to complicate things, but just remember this one simple idea. See, cameras only measure brightness, not colors. So effectively, as far as metering is concerned, your camera is seeing the world in black and white, from pure blacks to pure whites. And the middle of this range is what we generally call neutral gray, also known as 18% gray. And that is exactly what the camera considers to be the correct exposure. So when the meter is at 0, it's simply your camera telling you that the brightness it's reading averages out to 18% gray. And that word average is important because the camera doesn't care how bright your subject is or how bright your background is. It's just looking at all that brightness, averaging it out and deciding the right exposure. And this is where things can go very wrong if you blindly trust that exposure. For example, imagine your subject is dark, but the background behind it is very bright. To achieve that 18% gray or 18% brightness, the camera will suggest a much lower exposure. And if you are shooting in any of the auto modes, shutter priority, aperture priority, or even manual with auto ISO, the camera will actually set the exposure to what it thinks is right. And in this case, because the camera is lowering the exposure, your subject will become very dark and lose all the details. And this is exactly why metering modes exist. Metering modes give you the flexibility to decide which areas of the scene you want the camera to read the light from. Do you want the camera to consider the entire scene? Or do you want it to prioritize a smaller area like your subject? Or do you want it to give more importance to whatever is in the center of the frame? For example, if you want the camera to consider the entire scene, you have evaluative metering, also known as multi, segment, or matrix, depending on the brand you use. Now, if you want your camera to give importance to, let's say, the center of the frame, you have center weighted metering. And let's say if you want to choose a very specific spot or an area in the frame, you have spot metering for that. Now, I'm not going to bore you with the technical deep dive of each and every single metering mode because honestly, it doesn't matter. See, ask yourself, what's your actual goal? Is it to use the right metering mode or is it to get the right exposure every time you shoot? And the answer is simple. Our goal is to achieve the right exposure. How we achieve that right exposure, which metering mode do we use to get that exposure? I don't think that's really the important part. See, think of it like a race. Each metering mode gives you a different starting point in that race. Some starting points might get you closer to the right exposure faster, some slower. So just remember this for now. You can use any metering mode and arrive at the same final exposure. And I will show this to you in this video. Just bear with me. Now I'll share with you what my approach to metering is. See, in the chaos of the jungle, the last thing I want to do is make a snap decision about a camera setting. Wildlife photography is already quite unpredictable. I don't need my camera to be unpredictable too. So my approach is to not switch metering modes at all. It is dead simple. Pick one mode, learn everything about it, Learn when it succeeds, learn when it fails, and build your entire workflow around that one mode. Because here's the truth, every metering mode fails. None of them are foolproof. See, evaluative will struggle in high contrast light. Spot metering will ruin your shot if you point the spot at the wrong point even for a second. Since I know that failure is coming, I'd rather stay in one mode and master the fix instead of jumping between modes and hoping the camera gets it right. Now, the metering mode I use is evaluative. The main reason I use evaluative is because its behavior is very predictable. At a high level, it looks at the entire frame, breaks it into multiple zones, and then weighs each of those zones to decide the exposure. And because it looks at the entire scene, I know how it's going to react in different lighting situations. See, if the frame is mostly bright, evaluative is going to try and darken the exposure. If the frame is mostly dark, it's going to try and brighten it. It's that simple. And if the frame is fairly evenly lit, it will more often than not give me the right exposure straight away. See, once you understand this pattern, it becomes very easy to anticipate what your camera is going to do. The second reason I use evaluative is that it works for a large majority of situations I shoot in. See, most of the time, your scenes are going to be fairly evenly lit. Extreme backlit or very high contrast situations do happen, but they're not the norm. So it makes sense for me to use a mode that covers, say, 70 to 80% of my use cases, and then learn how to deal with the remaining situations. Now, you could very well ask, why not center weighted metering, or why not use spot metering? See, I can't use center weighted because it mandates me to put my subject in the center of the frame. And frankly, that's quite restrictive. Now, spot metering can actually be very powerful, but it's also quite volatile. And that's the main reason I can't use it as my default metering mode. See, in spot metering, the camera reads light from a very tiny area of the frame. So even a slight change in where that spot falls can completely change your exposure. If the spot lands on a darker area, the camera thinks the scene is too dark and tries to brighten it up. If it shifts even slightly and lands on a brighter area, the camera now suddenly thinks the scene is bright and pulls the exposure down. Now, in fast, dynamic situations, that kind of exposure swing, that is not something I'm comfortable with. Now, back to my workflow. See, evaluative metering isn't perfect as well. It does fail in certain situations, especially when the lighting gets tricky. When a scene is evenly lit, meaning when your subject and the background are receiving roughly the same amount of light, evaluative metering usually gives you a very balanced exposure. And most of the times, you can use that exposure straight away without changing anything. The problem starts when the lighting in your scene is uneven, when your subject and the background are very differently lit. And there are two very common situations when this happens. One, when your subject is dark, but the background is very bright. And two, when your subject is bright, but the background is very dark. In both these cases, evaluative metering will get the exposure wrong, always. If you blindly trust it, you will either end up with crushed shadows or blown highlights on the subject. The good news though is that these situations are very easy to correct once you understand what the camera is doing. And before I show that to you in action, just remember two things. If the frame is mostly bright, evaluative will try and reduce the exposure. If the frame is mostly dark, evaluative is going to try and brighten the scene. Let's see how to deal with these failures. Tricky situation number 1, dark subject, bright background. Now, you can see here that my subject is dark and the background behind it is quite bright. Now, since the background is very bright, evaluative here has tried to reduce the exposure. And in doing that, it has darkened the shadows. In this case, my subject. Now, the first step to fix this is to decide what do you want to expose for here. Do you want to expose for the subject or for the highlights? Let's go with the subject. Let's assume that all we want to do here is shoot a good portrait of this dummy. And to do that, I need to tell my camera to overexpose this scene. And I can simply do that by using exposure compensation. Now in this case, if I set my exposure compensation around +2, the subject looks just fine. The highlights in the background though look blown out. But that's fine because my priority here was the subject and not the background. Let's look at this exact same scene again, but with a different intention. This time, I want a silhouette, which means I want to expose for the highlights and not for the subject. To get a clean silhouette, I need to darken my subject. And to do that, I will simply dial a negative exposure compensation. Let's try -2. And there you go, a clean silhouette. Tricky situation number 2. Now let's flip the situation. Here the background is very dark, but the subject itself is quite bright. And this is the exposure Evaluative gives me by default. You can already see that some highlights on my subject are already blown out. Now this happens simply because most of the frame is dark. So the camera tries to brighten everything up. To fix this, all I need to do is dial in a negative exposure compensation until the subject looks right. Now the subject is perfectly exposed, but the background has gone very dark, which in this case is completely fine because my goal was to expose for the subject. I think you get the idea by now. See, I'm not changing metering modes at all. I'm just looking at what Evaluative gives me and making small adjustments to get the exposure I want. This is exactly what makes this approach simple, fast, and predictable in the field. Earlier in the video, remember I told you can get the same exposure using any metering mode. So let me show that to you quickly. I'm using spot metering now. And let's assume our goal is to recreate the silhouette. To do that, I can simply meter the bright part and there you go. Perfect silhouette again. And here are both the exposures side by side. Same result, just different starting points. Now that you've seen how I approach metering, let's quickly talk about why I like this approach. See, the biggest advantage of this approach is predictability. Because I stay in one metering mode, I understand exactly how my camera is going to react to different lighting situations. If the scene is mostly bright, I know the camera will try to darken it. If the scene is mostly dark, I know the camera will try to brighten it. There are no surprises. The second advantage is, of course, speed in the field. See, wildlife photography is fast. You don't have time to stop and think about which metering mode should I use in this scene, etc. etc. With this mode though, I already know what the camera is going to do, and I simply correct it using exposure compensation. The third advantage is less mental load. See, I'm removing one variable from the equation. I'm not juggling between metering modes in my head. I am just focusing on what I want to expose for. And over time, this has another big benefit. It trains your eye. You're physically looking at the frame and deciding how bright or how dark should it be. And especially in the tricky situations that we talked about, you're not depending on the camera to make that final decision for you. This improves your understanding of light and exposure in the long run. And finally, this works in almost every situation. Backlit, high contrast, silhouettes, dark forests, bright skies, it doesn't matter because I am not relying on my camera to be always right. I know when it will fail, and when it fails, I know how to correct it. So that's really it. See, metering doesn't have to be a source of stress in the field. And also, I am not saying that this is the only way or even the best way to shoot. Photographers have been switching between metering modes for decades. And for many, that manual control and those switches is exactly what works for their craft. There's nothing wrong with that. But for me personally, I have found that overthinking the modes often leads to either me missing the shot or getting a bad exposure. At the end of the day, the camera is just a tool. Whether you like to switch modes or stay in one like I do, the goal is the same. Seeing the light and deciding what actually matters in your frame. If this video helped simplify metering for you, consider subscribing. I share practical wildlife photography tips based on real field experience. Thanks for watching. I am Shantanu and I'll see you in the next one.